He swept the marble floors of the company he built from nothing, while the men wearing his name on their badges laughed at his shoes. But when the truth finally came out, the room went so silent, even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will make you question everything you think you know about success, kindness, and what it truly means to start over. The ballroom glittered like a cathedral made of glass and ego. Every chandelier shimmered in perfect rhythm with the music, and the air smelled like money disguised as roses. Laughter bounced off marble columns, champagne fizzed in crystal flutes, and beneath all that sparkle moved a man with a mop, Daniel Ward. 43. Once the name engraved on those marble walls, now the one cleaning beneath them. No one looked twice. Why would they? To them he was invisible, a shadow in a faded uniform, a background detail in someone else's celebration. He worked slowly, deliberately, the way one does when pretending not to remember. His reflection glimmered faintly in the polished floor, and for a fleeting moment, it wasn't a janitor staring back. It was the man who had built this company from a single garage blueprint, the one who'd slept under desks and written code until dawn. But memory had a way of turning triumph into torment. He pushed the mop forward, the rhythmic motion quieting the noise in his head. Across the room, a string quartet played something elegant and empty. Daniel caught fragments of conversation as he moved, stock options, mergers, a new prototype, revolutionizing connectivity. His design still in use. They had kept the idea and erased the name. He could almost laugh at the irony if it didn't still ache. 5 years ago, this had been his empire. 5 years ago, he'd walked into the hospital room where Amelia, his wife, lay pale and weightless beneath tubes and wires. He remembered her voice, soft but steady. "Promise me, Danny. Raise him to be kind, not powerful." He had promised, and then lost everything within a week. Richard Vance, his business partner, no, brother-in-arms once, had filed documents transferring ownership under the guise of stabilizing leadership, while Daniel spent nights holding Amelia's hand through morphine dreams. When she passed, so did the life he knew. The lawyers came next, then the headlines. Asteron CEO steps down amid internal dispute. No mention of betrayal, just a sanitized obituary for ambition. He didn't fight. Not then. He was too tired of losing things that mattered. Now he worked under the alias Dan Willis, part-time janitor, full-time ghost. A burst of laughter snapped him back. Near the stage, Richard Vance, perfect suit, perfect smile, was shaking hands with donors. His silver hair caught the light like arrogance polished to a shine. Daniel watched him raise a toast. "To legacy," Richard said, voice booming through the speakers. "To vision and to perseverance." The crowd cheered. Daniel kept wiping. He moved to the back corner where a tray of spilled champagne glistened like tiny fallen stars. A young server, no older than his son, whispered, "Sorry, sir. I'll take care of it." Daniel smiled faintly. "I've got it." He knelt, his knees creaking, and pressed the cloth to the marble. The cold bit through the fabric. He focused on the motion, the swirl, the press, the reflection clearing. In that glossy surface he could see them all, the executives, the investors, the same kind of men who had once called him visionary, before calling him liability. He caught his breath when Richard's gaze briefly swept the room and landed unknowingly on him. Recognition didn't flicker, just the kind of glance a man gives a worker who doesn't matter. Daniel dropped his eyes again, but something inside him tightened, a string pulled taut over years of silence. "Hey," someone snickered near the buffet. "2 interns, champagne loose. Look at that guy. You think he ever dreamed of being us?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He just wrung out the cloth, water dripping into the bucket like punctuation. If they only knew. The quartet shifted to a slow waltz. The lights dimmed, and the CEO's wife stepped onto the stage, announcing the evening's charity auction. Daniel backed into the shadows, his work done, his presence unwanted. But as the crowd applauded, his gaze caught on the brass plaque at the foot of the stage. Asteron Technologies, founded on vision, built by passion. He almost smiled. They'd removed his name years ago, but they hadn't removed his fingerprint from the metal. He could still feel it under his thumb when he polished it every week. He turned away, his cart squeaking softly toward the exit. He thought of Leo, asleep at home, and the lunchbox waiting for the morning. He thought of Amelia's last words. And as he pushed open the door to the cold hallway, he whispered to no one, "You wanted kindness." Maybe that's what this is. Behind him, applause swelled, but the sound no longer stung. What he didn't know was that among the clapping hands, a pair of eyes had followed him, curious, uncertain, searching. The daughter of the Empire. And soon, Daniel's quiet existence was about to collide with the world that had forgotten his name. Tonight, the janitor walked out unseen, but not for long. The apartment smelled faintly of soap and burnt toast, a scent that had somehow become home. Pipes groaned through the walls each morning as the laundromat downstairs came to life, humming with the rhythm of ordinary people trying to survive. Daniel Ward sat at the small kitchen table, sipping cheap coffee from a chipped mug. Across from him, Leo, 10 years old and full of unfiltered sunshine, was concentrating hard on tying his shoelaces. His tongue stuck out the way Amelia's used to when she painted. Every morning was the same ritual. Toast, laughter, the sound of Leo's backpack zipper, and the photograph. Leo picked it up from the counter with both hands, reverent as a priest holding scripture. The edges were soft and torn from time. Amelia smiled in that frozen summer sunlight, wind brushing her hair beneath a willow tree by the lake. Daniel never remembered who had taken the picture, only that it was the last one before the hospital days. "For luck," Leo said softly, handing it over like it was something sacred. Daniel took it, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "For luck," he echoed. He slipped the photo into the pocket of his work shirt over his heart and patted it once like a promise. It was a ritual between them, unspoken and necessary, as if that one small gesture kept the ghosts of the past from slipping too close. "You think she can see us?" Leo asked, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. He always asked every few weeks, like hope needed constant confirmation. "I think she never stopped," Daniel said. Leo smiled, satisfied with that answer, the way only a child could be. He dashed to the door, shoes squeaking on the old linoleum. "I'll tell Mrs. Garvey that you're a superhero," he called out. Daniel chuckled, pulling on his faded jacket. "Superheroes get better hours, kiddo." When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with Amelia's voice, soft and lingering, like the hum of a familiar melody. Raise him to be kind, not rich. He'd promised her that the night she realized she wouldn't make it. She'd taken his hand, her skin so thin, he could feel the pulse beneath it, and whispered those words like a final commandment. Kindness had cost him everything. His company, his pride, his name. But it had also given him Leo. And somehow, that trade felt fair. He looked around their small apartment, 2 rooms, 1 couch, 1 dream still breathing. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagged slightly in the corner, but laughter had painted over the imperfections. There were Leo's drawings taped everywhere. Stick figures holding hands, a man with a mop and a crown, a woman with yellow hair and angel wings. Beneath one, Leo had written in block letters, "Us." Daniel stood there for a long moment, his eyes burning, then exhaled. He tucked the photograph deeper into his pocket, grabbed his lunch pail, and headed for work. The walk to Asteron headquarters was only 6 blocks, but every step felt longer than the one before. The city had a cruel way of remembering him. His old office towered above like a monument to betrayal, glass gleaming with money he no longer touched. He passed a billboard with the Astron logo, a silver ring encircling a star. His design, his idea now stamped with Richard Vance's signature tagline, "Built for Tomorrow." He looked away. When he clocked in, the foreman gave him the usual nod, the kind reserved for men who do their jobs without making noise. Daniel liked it that way. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. Waiting for the right moment when truth could stand taller than power. That night, after hours of polishing the boardroom floors, Daniel sat on a crate in the maintenance closet, the hum of fluorescent lights keeping him company. He pulled the photograph from his pocket, tracing the edges with rough fingers. "We're doing all right, Mel," he whispered. "He's got your courage." He thought of Leo's laughter, how it filled the room like light through a broken window. He thought of how his son still believed in good people, even in a world that rewarded cruelty. And for the first time in years, Daniel smiled, not the kind that hid pain, but the kind that remembered warmth. Because what Leo didn't know, what Daniel never said, was that his silence wasn't surrender, it was patience. It was the sound of a storm gathering, quiet but certain. One day the world would remember his name, but tonight it was enough that his son did. The snow outside the glass walls of Astron headquarters fell in soft spirals, glittering under the city lights. Inside, the ballroom pulsed with warmth and wealth, sequins catching flashes of gold, champagne glasses raised like trophies, and laughter loud enough to drown humility. The annual Astron Winter Gala had become a spectacle of vanity, a celebration of profits disguised as philanthropy. This year's theme, "Legacy in Motion," was printed in embossed silver on every program. Ironically, the only legacy truly in motion was the one they'd stolen. Daniel Ward entered quietly through the service corridor, the hum of machinery behind him, fading into the clink of crystal ahead. He wore the same gray uniform as every other janitor, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the handle of his cleaning cart. The scent of expensive perfume and aged scotch hit him like a ghost of the past. He had walked these halls before, not as an employee, but as a dreamer, a builder, a man who once believed in what this company stood for. Now he was there to sweep up the glittering debris of other people's illusions. From the corner of the ballroom, Daniel worked methodically. The marble floors he'd chosen years ago reflected the chandeliers he had helped design, their spiraling glass tiers inspired by constellations. He still remembered sketching the concept late one night with Amelia asleep beside him. He'd wanted the light to feel alive, like the first spark of an idea. Now it illuminated strangers pretending to understand the meaning of legacy. At the center of it all stood Richard Vance, immaculately tailored, silver-haired, smiling with that same polished charm that once fooled the world. Cameras followed him like he was royalty. "To innovation," Richard declared, raising his glass. "To the relentless spirit of Astron, built by vision, driven by leadership, and sustained by integrity." The room erupted in applause. Daniel's hand tightened around the mop handle until his knuckles paled. "Built by vision," he thought bitterly. "Yes, just not yours." He caught fragments of conversations as he worked. Talk of new product lines, investment bonuses, Richard's upcoming profile in a tech magazine. His own name, the name that had once graced patents and board minutes, was nowhere. It hadn't been for years. He'd become a ghost that haunted the architecture. Invisible, yet impossible to erase completely. Near the stage, a young employee stumbled, spilling red wine across the carpet. The liquid spread like a wound, dark and vivid, under the chandelier's light. Before anyone could react, Daniel was already there, kneeling, blotting the stain with practiced precision. "It's okay," he said softly to the trembling intern. "Happens to everyone." But before the boy could thank him, a voice from behind cut through the noise. "Careful," someone whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "The janitor's more excited to touch the carpet than his paycheck." Laughter followed, nervous, cruel, the kind that feeds on hierarchy. Daniel paused, eyes on the fabric beneath his hands. Then he smiled, not out of amusement, but restraint. The kind of smile that holds a storm behind it. "The carpet's safe," he said simply, standing to his full height. "It's built to handle spills." A few people chuckled awkwardly, not realizing the irony. He had chosen that fabric himself, years ago. Richard, watching from the podium, glanced at him briefly with vague irritation, the way one might look at a fly that refused to leave the champagne. Daniel bowed his head and stepped back into the shadows. Music swelled as the auction began. The first item up for bid was an engraved sculpture, the Visionary Flame, dedicated to the founders who lit the path. The crowd clapped politely, unaware that the artist had based the design on a photograph of Daniel from Asteron's early days. No one mentioned it. Why would they? The story had been rewritten, the credits reassigned. As the night wore on, Daniel continued his quiet orbit around the room, cleaning glasses left on tables, adjusting toppled chairs, wiping fingerprints off the piano. Each action felt like a confession, each motion a reminder that he still belonged here more than anyone realized. He caught his reflection again in the glass. Older now, yes, but not defeated, just patient. When the final toast ended and applause echoed like thunder in marble halls, Daniel lingered near the edge of the light. He looked up at the chandeliers, his chandeliers, and whispered, "Legacy in motion, huh?" He smiled faintly, almost amused, because deep down he knew something the rest didn't. Truth doesn't vanish when you bury it. It waits quietly until the world grows still enough to hear it again. And tonight, under the same lights he once designed to illuminate brilliance, Daniel Ward was ready to let that truth find its way home. Olivia Vance had learned early that silence was the most powerful language in a room full of people who loved to hear themselves speak. She'd grown up in these parties, gilded evenings that smelled like wealth and exhaustion, where her father's name echoed off the chandeliers like gospel. Richard Vance, visionary, builder, CEO, the legend, the myth, the man. But standing in that ballroom surrounded by champagne and ego, Olivia felt like she was watching a movie she'd already seen too many times. It wasn't that she didn't admire him, she did in the way a child admires a distant planet, but lately the light around him felt colder. She was halfway through a polite conversation with a board member's son when she noticed him, the janitor. At first she didn't know why her eyes lingered. He was quiet, deliberate in his movements, his hands steady as he wheeled a cart toward the stage. There was nothing remarkable about him, not to anyone else. But something about the way he looked at the room caught her attention. Not in awe, not with resentment, just recognition. Like a man studying an old photograph of a home he once lived in. Olivia tilted her head, curiosity unfurling. She had heard whispers about a disgruntled co-founder back in the early days of Asteron, a man who'd supposedly abandoned ship when things got hard. Her father never said his name, only that he wasn't built for pressure. The story had always sounded rehearsed, polished for public digestion. But the way the janitor's eyes traced the blueprints etched into the room, the way his hand brushed against the wall panels with a quiet sort of ownership, made something uneasy stir inside her. When the light above her table began to flicker, the guests barely noticed. Olivia did. She watched as the janitor approached, toolbox in hand. "Sorry for the interruption, ma'am," he murmured, his voice low, worn smooth by time. She nodded, studying his face. There was a stillness in him that didn't belong to the service staff, an almost painful calm. As he reached up to tighten the bulb, the sleeve of his uniform slipped just enough to reveal the edge of a ring on his finger. At first it was just a glint of metal, but when the light steadied again, she caught the engraving, AW1. Her heart paused. She knew that mark. Her father's ring had the same inscription, displayed proudly in his office like a relic of genius. The only one ever made, he'd once told her. The janitor noticed her looking, For a fraction of a second their eyes met. His were deep and unguarded, carrying the kind of tired intelligence you can't fake. Then he smiled faintly, a polite acknowledgement, and turned back to his work. Olivia blinked, suddenly unsure if she'd imagined the entire moment. But when he wheeled his cart away, she felt a quiet certainty she couldn't explain settle in her chest. Later, after the gala blurred into another late-night speech about vision and expansion, Olivia slipped away to the balcony. Snow fell like ash outside, swirling against the glass. She opened her sketchbook, a habit she'd never outgrown, and began to draw. Not the dancers, not the skyline. Him, the janitor. The lines came easily, the shape of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he focused, the quiet strength in his posture. She caught herself adding small details, the reflection of the chandelier in his eyes, the faded initials on the ring. She stopped, pen hovering above the page. It didn't make sense. Why would a janitor wear something that belonged to Asteron's founding line? And why did he move like he knew every inch of the building's soul? Through the ballroom doors, she could still hear her father laughing, charming investors, building futures. He had always told her the past didn't matter, that only vision did. But standing there, with the sketch half finished in her lap, Olivia began to wonder if the past wasn't done with them yet. She closed the notebook and pressed her palm against the cover. Somewhere deep in her chest, a truth whispered like static through silence. He's not who they think he is. And though she didn't know why, Olivia found herself hoping, no, believing, that she'd just met the one person in that room whose story hadn't been bought or buried. The gala ended the way all grand illusions do. Too much laughter, too much perfume, too much pretending. The last of the guests drifted out beneath a shower of camera flashes while the staff moved like ghosts cleaning up the aftermath of glamour. Daniel wheeled his cart through the quiet corridors, his steps slow, his back aching but steady. The music had faded, but the echo of it clung to the marble walls, hollow and insincere. He took the freight elevator, the one that didn't smell of champagne and conversation, only steel and detergent. The hum of the machinery was the closest thing to peace he'd felt all night. He pressed the button for the sublevel, the place where the world never noticed people like him. As the doors began to close, a soft voice cut through the silence. "Wait, hold it, please." He instinctively reached to press the button again, and a slim figure slipped inside, breathless but composed. Olivia Vance stood before him, still in her silver gown, holding a tray of untouched desserts like a peace offering. "Looks like I crashed the wrong elevator," she said, catching her breath. Her tone was light, but her eyes were studying him, searching for something she didn't yet understand. Daniel offered a polite nod. "There's no wrong one," he said. "They all go down eventually." Olivia smiled faintly, then turned her gaze upward. "You designed that chandelier, didn't you?" Daniel froze. His hand tightened around the mop handle, the air between them stilling. "Why would you think that?" he asked, his voice careful, calm on the surface but rippling underneath. She tilted her head, watching him with quiet certainty. "Because no janitor looks at light like it owes him an apology." For a moment silence stretched thin between them. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel laughed. It was soft, almost startled, the sound of a man remembering what laughter used to feel like. "You've got a strange way of seeing the world," he said. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe I just notice the people no one else does." He met her gaze then, and for the first time in years, someone looked back at him, not as a worker, not as a ghost, but as a man who might have once mattered. The elevator rattled as it descended, and Olivia waited for him to speak. He didn't. His silence said enough, an unspoken yes, wrapped in weariness. "Who are you?" she asked softly. The elevator chimed before he could answer. The doors opened to the dimly lit service corridor. Daniel gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "Just someone cleaning up after other people's messes," he said, and stepped out, pushing his cart into the shadows. Olivia stood frozen in the elevator, the hum of the machinery swallowing the rest of the world. She wanted to call after him, to demand the truth she felt hovering between them, but the doors slid shut before courage could find her voice. That night, back in her penthouse, Olivia couldn't sleep. The city lights bled through the windows, and the gala's laughter still echoed in her head, but underneath it all was his voice, the calm certainty of a man who didn't belong among them, yet somehow did. She pulled out her tablet and opened the company archives. It was curiosity at first, then something deeper, something like a quiet hunger for truth. She typed his name, Daniel, though she didn't know the last. Nothing. Then she searched by image, filtering through years of corporate photographs, press releases, anniversaries. Finally, buried in an untagged folder from Asteron's early years, she found it. A faded black-and-white photo labeled Prototype Launch, Year 1. Two men stood at the center, younger versions of her father and the janitor, Daniel Ward. Her heart stuttered. She zoomed in, reading the caption aloud in a whisper that barely made it past her lips. Founders, Daniel Ward and Richard Vance. The air left her lungs. She scrolled further, scanning articles, old patents, interviews. Every trace of Daniel's name stopped abruptly 5 years ago. It was as though he'd been erased, rewritten out of the company's DNA. The narrative her father had built, the abandoned partner, the man who'd walked away, suddenly reeked of omission. She stared at the photo again. Daniel's expression in it wasn't one of weakness or retreat. It was focus, fire, the look of someone who believed in something bigger than himself. And now that same man was cleaning floors in the company he'd built. Olivia closed the tablet, her reflection ghosting back at her through the glass. She thought about the ring she'd seen, the way he'd touched the walls like they still spoke to him, everything she'd been told about Asteron, about her father, about legacy, shifted beneath her feet. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and relentless, covering the city in a thin layer of truth, waiting to be uncovered. And for the first time in her life, Olivia Vance realized that not every story told by power is the one worth believing. The rain that night fell in a slow, steady rhythm against the window pane, a sound both comforting and cruel. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table of his apartment, the same spot where he'd eaten breakfast with Leo that morning, the same chair where he had once read bedtime stories. Now it was a battlefield of paper, old documents, unpaid bills, and at the center, the letter that had ended his life as he knew it. He unfolded it carefully, though he had long since memorized every word. The paper had yellowed at the creases, the ink faded in places, but the first line still struck like a blade. Effective immediately, your shares and patents are transferred under emergency restructuring. It was the word effective that always burned the most. So final, so clean, a surgical betrayal. He'd been sitting in a hospital room when that letter arrived, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. Amelia's breathing shallow beside him. He remembered opening it while her hand rested in his, her pulse faint under his thumb. At first he hadn't understood. He'd thought it was temporary, a restructuring until he could return to work. Then the lawyers called, then the headlines came, then the silence. He traced a finger over the signature at the bottom, Richard Vance. His name written with the same deliberate confidence it always carried. Daniel used to admire that about him, his precision, his charm, his ability to sell conviction as truth. Together, they'd built Asteron from nothing but code and coffee-stained sketches. Daniel had been the architect, Richard the salesman. It worked, until the night it didn't. He'd discovered the forgery too late. The board had already voted. The patents had already been reassigned. By the time he walked back into those glass towers, the security guards had new orders and new smiles that didn't include him. The press called it a mutual separation. Richard made a statement about creative differences and personal challenges. They framed him as unstable, a grieving husband who'd lost touch with reality. Grief, they said, makes men dangerous. Conveniently, it also makes them easy to silence. He'd tried to fight back. God, he had. But he was one man against an army of lawyers and a machine that never slept. They drained him, one letter, one court date, one bill at a time. When Amelia died, he didn't even have enough left to bury her in the plot they'd chosen together. Astron sent flowers, white lilies. He never opened the card. So he disappeared, took a name no one would question, a job no one would envy, and a life small enough to survive inside. He'd stopped looking back until tonight. The photo from the gala replayed in his mind, Olivia's eyes catching his. The question she didn't ask but already knew the answer to. There was something different about her. She didn't have her father's sharpness, that cutting instinct to control a room. Hers was quieter, searching. If anyone could see through the lie, maybe it was her. He stood, the letter still in his hand, and walked into Leo's room. His son slept curled beneath a blanket, a soft hum escaping his lips, the melody Amelia used to sing before bedtime. Beside him on the nightstand sat her photograph, the corners frayed, the color almost gone. The woman under the willow tree still smiled, still looked at him with that same calm faith that used to make him believe anything was possible. Daniel sat at the edge of the bed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to know who I was," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth, heavier than truth. But more than that, who I still am. He brushed a strand of hair from Leo's forehead. The boy stirred, mumbling something about dreams and stars, and Daniel smiled faintly. For years, he had convinced himself that staying quiet was protection, that anonymity was safer than justice. But now he saw it for what it was, surrender dressed as sacrifice. The truth hadn't died, it had been waiting, and if Olivia had seen it, if she had really seen him, then maybe the world could again. He folded the letter, slid it into the bottom drawer of his desk, and poured himself a glass of water that trembled faintly in his hand. Outside, the city lights flickered across the wet streets like a pulse. He closed his eyes and exhaled. He had vanished once. That was his mistake. Now Daniel Ward was ready to return, not as a ghost, but as the man who had built the empire that forgot his name. The city outside her window was asleep, but Olivia Vance wasn't. Her apartment was awash in the pale glow of her laptop screen, papers scattered across the table like a crime scene of forgotten truths. Coffee steamed untouched beside her as she scrolled through file after file, digging through Astron's archives with growing unease. Every record she opened felt like lifting a curtain her father had spent years sewing shut. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for, only that she couldn't stop looking. The name Daniel Ward echoed in her head like a melody she couldn't place but somehow already knew by heart. At first it was small things, a patent signature, an early prototype schematic, a grant proposal. Every one of them bore Daniel's name before her father's, Ward and Vance. Not Vance and Ward. That detail alone might have meant nothing to someone else, but Olivia had grown up studying her father's meticulousness. Order mattered to him. Credit mattered even more. The pattern continued file after file, until suddenly, nothing. 5 years ago, Daniel's name simply vanished, like a chapter torn clean from a book. Olivia leaned back, her pulse quickening. She cross-referenced company databases, public filings, even media archives. But Daniel Ward ceased to exist after a date that coincided with another event she knew all too well, the year her mother died. That was when her father changed, when ambition hardened into something colder. She stared at the screen, Daniel's digital ghost staring back at her from an old photograph. Him and Richard at the first Astron launch, both young, both confident. But it was Daniel who stood with the blueprints in hand, the one speaking to the crowd, while her father smiled for the cameras beside him. The caption read, "Founders, Daniel Ward and Richard Vance." Her throat tightened. The clock struck 4, and she shut the laptop. the sound loud in the quiet room. Her reflection in the dark window looked like someone else, a woman seeing her own bloodline under a harsher light. She picked up her phone, thumb hovering over her father's contact, then stopped. Not yet. She needed to see him face to face. By morning, the house smelled of espresso and control. Her father sat at the breakfast table, reading the financial section like nothing in the world could surprise him. The man who had built empires and bent markets to his will looked every bit the part, calm, collected, unreachable. Olivia stood in the doorway, fingers clenched around a printed copy of Daniel's patent filings. "Who was Daniel Ward?" she asked, her voice steady but trembling underneath. Richard's fork paused midair. For a second he didn't move. Then he set it down carefully, as though even gravity waited for his permission. "A mistake," he said, "one that nearly cost us everything." "Everything?" she repeated, her disbelief sharp. "You mean this company? This empire you've built on his work?" His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for the first time she saw something unfamiliar in them. Not anger, not even guilt. Fear. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said softly, "and you shouldn't go looking for things that don't concern you." Olivia stepped closer, the papers trembling in her grip. "He built this company," she said, her voice breaking through the polished calm of the room. "He built you." Her father's expression hardened, his tone turning to ice. "Enough." But she didn't stop. "You erased him. Why?" Richard stood, the chair scraping against the marble. "Because he wasn't strong enough," he said. "He had ideas, but no will. He let grief destroy him. I did what I had to do, to save Asteron from collapsing under his weakness." Olivia stared at him, the words hitting harder than he knew. "Or to save yourself," she whispered. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them was thick, charged. Then her father picked up his paper again, dismissing her without looking. "You'll understand one day. Legacy demands sacrifice." She turned to leave, her stomach twisting. At the door, she looked back once more. He was reading, but his hand trembled when he reached for his coffee cup. That was when she knew. The truth wasn't buried. It hadn't been destroyed or forgotten. It was still here, alive, sweeping the halls at night with a mop and a memory, quietly haunting the empire built on its silence. Olivia walked out into the cold morning air, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had the first and most dangerous one of all. Her father was lying, and she was going to find out why. Morning sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, soft and gold, landing across the small kitchen table where Leo sat, swinging his legs and humming to himself. Daniel poured coffee into a cracked mug, the smell of toast faint in the air, when Leo pushed a folded piece of paper toward him. "I made something," he said proudly, crumbs dotting his cheeks. Daniel wiped his hands on a dish towel and sat down, unfolding the paper. The drawing was done in bold crayon strokes, a silver circle with a star in the middle, the old Asteron logo, surrounded by bright yellow lines like rays of light. Around it, Leo had drawn smaller stars, each one a little uneven, a little human. Above it, in crooked letters, he'd written, "D. A D's Company." Daniel's chest tightened. "You drew my old company?" he asked quietly. Leo nodded, grinning. "You told me stories about it once. The place where you built stuff to help people." Daniel smiled faintly, though it ached to do so. "You remembered that?" "I always remember," Leo said. He picked up another crayon and added a shooting star to the corner. "You said you made things that made life easier. So why don't you make them again?" The question hit harder than Daniel expected. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of scrubbing, fingers once meant for keyboards and blueprints, now marked by calluses and cleaning chemicals. He reached over and ruffled Leo's hair, trying to hide the heaviness in his chest. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "the world isn't ready for what you build." Leo looked up at him, puzzled, then shrugged in the way only children can. "Maybe it's not the world that's not ready," he said. "Maybe it's you." Daniel froze, his hand still in Leo's hair. The boy didn't notice the silence that followed. He was too busy coloring another corner of the page blue. Daniel let out a quiet laugh, one that sounded more like an exhale than joy. "You might be right," he murmured. Leo looked up again, his eyes bright. "Mom used to say that, didn't she?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, she did." He folded the drawing carefully, sliding it into his jacket pocket, as though it were something fragile. "Finish your breakfast, champ." "We've got a big day." But for the rest of the morning, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what his son had said. Maybe it wasn't the world that wasn't ready. Maybe it was him, afraid to face what he'd lost, afraid to admit he still cared. That night, after Leo had fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The apartment was quiet except for the muffled hum of the laundromat below. He stared at the photograph of Amelia on the shelf, her smile still soft, still full of belief. "You'd tell me to stop hiding," he whispered. "You'd tell me to finish what I started." He stood, opened the closet, and reached for a long cardboard tube buried beneath old jackets and cleaning supplies. Dust rose in a soft cloud as he pulled it free. The cap came off with a faint pop, and Daniel unrolled the blueprints across the table. The paper was worn, corners curled, the ink faded. But the designs were still breathtaking. Circuitry sketches intertwined with human handwriting, layers of AI-integrated systems, decades ahead of their time. His handwriting. Not Richard's. These were his designs, his work, his forgotten brilliance. He traced one of the lines with his finger, a memory coming back in flashes. Late nights in the lab, Amelia bringing him coffee, her laughter when he'd fall asleep on his desk. "You're trying to teach the world to think, Danny," she'd said once. "Just don't forget to feel while you do it." He smiled faintly at the memory, but it faded into something heavier. The realization that Asteron had shelved these projects, dismissed them as too risky, only to rebrand watered-down versions years later under Richard's name. His jaw tightened. He looked toward the small bedroom where Leo slept, one hand clutching his sketchbook. "You said you wanted me to make things again," Daniel whispered. "Maybe it's time." He rolled up the blueprints, this time not to hide them but to keep them close. The part of him that had died 5 years ago, the builder, the innovator, the dreamer, stirred like a dormant engine catching its first spark. Outside, the rain had stopped and the city was washed clean under the glow of streetlights. Daniel stood by the window, the old drawing still in his pocket, and for the first time in years he felt something other than defeat. Not hope exactly, but something quieter. Movement. It began with a single email. No sender name, no signature, just a subject line that sliced through inboxes across the industry like a whisper turning into a scream. Who really founded Asteron? Attached was one photo, the same black and white image Olivia had unearthed. Daniel and Richard side by side, young, hungry, unknowing of the empire they'd build or the betrayal waiting years ahead. Within an hour, tech journalists were forwarding it to editors. Within 2, hashtags bloomed across social media like wildfire. By midday, hashtag #WhoIsDanielWard was trending globally. The photograph spread faster than truth could catch up. Some said it was a hoax, a publicity stunt. Others claimed it was the missing piece of an old corporate cover-up. Every news outlet had a different version. The headlines grew bolder by the hour. The ghost founder of Asteron, hidden genius, or bitter fraud. For the first time in years, Daniel's name, the one buried and replaced, was back in circulation. And yet, while the world speculated, Daniel was doing what he'd always done. Working. The mop glided across the marble floors of Asteron headquarters, the rhythm steady, almost meditative. He heard the whispers, of course. They floated through the hallways like gossip wearing perfume, faint but impossible to ignore. "That's him, right? The guy from the photo? No way, that's just some janitor." But look, The eyes, the jawline, it's uncanny. He never responded. He didn't need to. Truth didn't need defending when it was finally waking up. Upstairs, in the glass conference room that overlooked the skyline, Richard Vance was a storm barely contained. "Find out who leaked this," he barked, slamming his palm against the table. "Every archive, every drive, every employee. I want answers before this thing destroys us." His assistant nodded nervously, typing notes with trembling fingers. Around him, board members exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared mention what they all feared, that the truth, if confirmed, could undo everything they'd built on his name. Olivia sat quietly at the far end of the table, pretending to take notes. The photo glowed on the projection screen, her father's smile, Daniel's steady gaze beside him. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She knew the source of the leak. She hadn't meant for it to explode like this. She'd sent it anonymously to one journalist, one she trusted, believing they'd verify before publishing. But the story had taken on a life of its own. She kept her head down, eyes on her notepad, while her father's fury filled the room. Richard turned toward her suddenly. "You," he said sharply. "You're quiet. What do you make of all this?" Olivia looked up slowly. "I think," she said carefully, "that if it isn't true, it shouldn't be so hard to prove." The room went silent. Richard's expression froze for a heartbeat too long before he forced a smile. "Spoken like a lawyer," he said. "Remind me to hire you if this turns into a case." Laughter flickered, nervous and hollow. Olivia didn't laugh. That evening, reporters camped outside the Asteron building, flashes cutting through the dusk like lightning, microphones thrust forward as executives rushed to their cars. Is Daniel Ward alive? Was he forced out? Did Asteron falsify its founding history? No one answered. Inside, Daniel watched from the shadows of the lobby, expression unreadable. He wasn't hiding, not anymore. He simply didn't need to step into the noise. The truth was speaking for itself. He clocked out quietly at midnight, the city lights shimmering on wet pavement. His phone buzzed with messages from unknown numbers, reporters, old colleagues, strangers claiming to be friends. He ignored them all. He stopped by Leo's room when he got home, tucking the boy's blanket up around his chin. "Dad," Leo murmured sleepily, "why are people talking about you on TV?" Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, the question pressing deeper than it sounded. "Because," he said softly, "sometimes when you tell the truth too late, people forget what it sounds like." Leo blinked drowsily. "Are you in trouble?" He smiled faintly. The conference room gleamed with the kind of perfection only money could polish. White marble floors, brass fixtures, walls lined with the company's achievements framed like holy scripture. Reporters packed the space shoulder to shoulder, their cameras and microphones angled toward the podium that bore Asteron's silver insignia. Outside, protesters chanted, flashes of handmade signs reading, "Truth has a name," reflected in the mirrored glass. Inside, the air felt like a held breath, waiting to break. Richard Vance stood at the center of it all, the embodiment of control. His suit was immaculate, his voice smooth as glass. "We at Asteron are proud of our history," he began, each word measured and polished. "Mr. Daniel Ward was a valued employee, but his role has been, unfortunately, misinterpreted in recent media coverage." The statement landed like poison disguised as perfume. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched. The journalists didn't buy it, not really, but they wanted the sound bite. Richard continued, confident in his ability to bend perception, just as he always had. Mr. Ward made early contributions, certainly, but the foundation of Asteron, as it stands today, was shaped by an entire team. It was collaboration, not ownership. Olivia stood at the back of the room, her stomach a knot of fury. She had told herself she wouldn't do it, not here, not like this. But watching him rewrite history again, standing under the same logo Daniel had once dreamed up, made something in her snap. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Her fingers tightened around the folder she'd stolen from his office the night before. Inside was the document, the one he'd buried, the one that could no longer be denied. Richard went on, voice swelling with practiced gravitas. Let's remember that Asteron's story is one of perseverance, of leadership, of innovation. That's a lie. The microphone caught her words before the security team could move. The sound rang through the hall like glass shattering. Every camera in the room swung toward her. Richard froze mid-sentence, his face a mask of disbelief. Olivia stepped forward, trembling but certain. That's a lie, she repeated, louder this time. Her voice wasn't perfect, it wavered, but it was strong enough. She walked to the stage, ignoring the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. He wasn't your employee, she said, locking eyes with her father. He was your partner. Richard's jaw tightened. Olivia, this is not the time. No, it's exactly the time. She opened the folder and held up the faded incorporation document, her hands shaking. And this, she said, her voice breaking, proves it. Gasps filled the room. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. The seal of the state, the signatures, the founding date. Everything was visible. 2 names. Daniel Ward, Richard Vance, equal partners. Richard's composure cracked. His face drained of color as whispers turned into shouts, reporters surging forward like a tide. Miss Vance? One of them shouted. Are you confirming the allegations that Asteron's founder was wrongfully removed? Another yelled, Did you leak the documents? Security tried to intervene, but the damage was already done. The story was out, live-streamed and recorded, the truth spilling faster than any PR spin could contain. Richard stepped toward his daughter, voice low, desperate. You don't understand what you've done. Oh, I understand, she said, meeting his eyes. I just can't understand how you live with it. The noise swelled, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, questions firing like bullets. Richard stumbled through a response, but his voice cracked under the weight of scrutiny. The calm, untouchable titan of Asteron was gone. In his place stood a man exposed. Somewhere across the city, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Daniel Ward sat on the edge of his couch, the flickering light of an old television casting shadows across his tired face. The screen showed the chaos unfolding, the daughter of the man who'd stolen his life, standing up for him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just watched, a lifetime of silence catching in his throat. When Olivia lifted the document toward the cameras, Daniel's vision blurred, not from disbelief, but from something he hadn't felt in years, vindication. Not victory, just the quiet, aching relief of finally being seen. He leaned back, hands trembling, and wiped at his eyes. The world was loud again with his name, but for once it didn't sound like mockery. It sounded like truth reclaiming its breath. For the first time in years, Daniel Ward wasn't invisible. And for the first time ever, the world was listening. The door burst open with the kind of force that makes walls remember. Richard Vance strode into the small janitorial office like a man trying to set the world back in order through sheer will. His tie was loosened, his eyes bloodshot, his composure shattered. The hum of the fluorescent light above buzzed between them like static as Daniel looked up from the supply shelf, unshaken. "You think you won?" Richard hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut. Daniel didn't move. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag before folding it neatly on the table. "I didn't come back for war," he said quietly. Richard laughed, but it was the kind that carried no humor, only disbelief. "No? Then what the hell do you want?" Daniel's gaze was steady, calm in a way that made the other man's fury look almost childish. "To clean up what you made dirty." That silenced him. For a heartbeat, the room was still except for the hum of the vending machine in the corner and the echo of rain against the window. Richard's chest rose and fell, each breath ragged, his anger fighting to find direction. Finally, he stepped forward, slamming a folder onto the small metal desk so hard the surface rattled. Papers spilled slightly from the edges. "Here," he snapped, "a settlement. You'll get what you should have gotten years ago, and more. You sign this, you disappear again. No more interviews, no more drama. You get your piece." Daniel looked down at the folder but didn't touch it. "Peace?" he murmured. "You can't buy that." Richard leaned closer, his voice low and venomous. "You're a janitor, Daniel. A ghost. You think the world suddenly cares because my daughter decided to have a conscience? The headlines will fade. They always do. But if you're smart, you'll take what's left and vanish before this turns into something uglier." Daniel finally lifted his eyes, and Richard froze. There was no defiance in that gaze, no rage, no triumph, just clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, it listens. "I already did that once," Daniel said softly. Richard straightened, startled by the calm. He'd expected a fight, maybe even tears, anything human enough to prove that Daniel still wanted what had been stolen. But what stared back at him wasn't a man begging for justice. It was someone who had already made peace with truth, and that made him dangerous. "You think you can just waltz back into my life," Richard spat, "and undo everything I built?" Daniel almost smiled. "I don't have to undo anything. You did that yourself." The words landed heavier than anger ever could. Richard's jaw tightened, his composure cracking again. "You were never built for this world," he said. "You always wanted everything to mean something, but it doesn't. It's business, it's survival." Daniel nodded slowly. "And that's why you'll never understand legacy." He stepped closer, voice lowering, each word steady as stone. "You built a company. I built a purpose. One of those survives longer." The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard's face twitched, somewhere between fury and fear. He grabbed the folder and shoved it toward Daniel again, his hand trembling now. "Sign it," he barked. Daniel placed a gentle hand on the folder and slid it back across the desk. "No," he said simply. "You don't get to decide how I disappear anymore." Richard stared at him, the weight of those words sinking in. For the first time, he saw Daniel not as a rival or a mistake, but as the mirror he'd spent years avoiding. The same man he'd once admired, envied, and finally betrayed. And in that reflection, he saw something terrifying. Peace. Not the fragile kind that came from comfort, but the unshakable kind that comes from truth. Richard stepped back, his voice faltering. "You'll regret this." Daniel smiled faintly, picking up his mop again, as if the world hadn't just shifted between them. "No," he said. "You will." When Richard left, the door slammed hard enough to rattle the window pane. But Daniel didn't move. He stood there for a long time, staring at the puddle of rainwater spreading under the door, the hum of the light above him steady and soft. For the first time in years, he felt still, not like a man seeking redemption, but like someone who had already found it. Richard could keep the titles, the headlines, the empire built on theft. Daniel had something else entirely, truth. And unlike power, it didn't need to be seen to endure. The knock came just after sunset, soft and uncertain, the kind of sound that belonged to someone unsure if they should be there. Daniel opened the door to find Olivia standing in the hallway, her coat dusted with the fine grit of the city, a tote bag slung over her shoulder. She looked tired but determined, the way people look when truth has stripped away every comfortable illusion they've ever known. "I brought some things for Leo," she said. Her voice carried the faint tremor of someone who wasn't used to asking permission. Daniel hesitated only a second before stepping aside. The apartment was small, warm in a lived-in way. The walls bore Leo's drawings, sketches of stars, gears, and imaginary machines. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, blending with the quiet hum of the laundromat below. Olivia set the bag on the table and pulled out a stack of books, a few colored pencils, and a small model kit. "For his school project," she explained. "I thought he might like building something." Daniel smiled faintly, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she replied. Leo peeked from the bedroom doorway, his hair a mess of sleep and curiosity. "Hi," he said shyly. "Hi, Leo," Olivia said, crouching to his level. "I brought you something to build." His eyes lit up. "Really?" "Really." He took the kit carefully, as if it were something sacred, and whispered a quiet thank you before retreating back into the room, already lost to his new treasure. When he was gone, Olivia looked around the apartment, at the scuffed floorboards, the cracked window, the single-framed photo of a woman smiling under a willow tree. "Is that her?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Amelia." He didn't say more, but the weight behind the name was enough. They sat at the small kitchen table, two mismatched mugs between them. The clock ticked steadily, a metronome for words that came slower than thoughts. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "Why didn't you fight harder?" Daniel's fingers traced the rim of his mug, eyes distant. "Because fighting makes you lose sight of what you're protecting," he said. "I wasn't protecting my company. I was protecting my son's innocence." She frowned gently. "But it was yours. You built it. Doesn't he deserve to know that?" "He will," Daniel said, "but not through bitterness. I want him to see what resilience looks like, not revenge." The simplicity of it caught her off guard. Olivia had grown up in a world where survival meant dominance, where success was measured in headlines and numbers. To her father, compassion was weakness dressed in poetry. Yet here was Daniel, stripped of everything her father valued, and somehow he seemed more complete. "He's lucky to have you," she said quietly. Daniel looked up, and for a moment she saw a hint of the man he must have been years ago, bright, steady, whole. "No," he said. "I'm lucky he never stopped believing." Olivia blinked back tears she hadn't realized were forming. The truth of that sentence sat heavy in the space between them. She thought of her own childhood, of growing up in a house that measured love by achievement and affection by obedience. Her father had built an empire, yes, but in doing so he had hollowed out everything human inside it. Daniel, on the other hand, had built something quieter, something lasting, not a company, a life. She took a sip of coffee to steady herself. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think legacy was about what you leave behind." Daniel smiled faintly. "It is, but not the kind that fits in vaults or plaques. Legacy's what survives in people, not papers." In the next room, Leo's laughter rang out, pure, unfiltered, the sound of a boy discovering joy in creation. Olivia listened, her chest tightening with something she couldn't name. "He reminds me of you," she said. Daniel chuckled. "He's braver than I ever was." They sat in silence for a long moment, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The city murmured outside, lights blinking through the thin curtains. Olivia glanced once more at the photograph on the wall, then at Daniel, who now looked peaceful in a way she'd never seen him before. She realized then that Daniel Ward hadn't just built a company. He'd built character, layer by layer, brick by brick, through loss and love and quiet endurance. The empire her father had built stood tall but hollow. The life Daniel had built was small but unshakably alive. When she left that night, the rain had started again, soft and steady. She looked back once before turning the corner. Through the window she saw Daniel and Leo bent over the table, assembling the model together. Not an empire, not a legacy carved in stone, something better, something real. The knock came early, long before the sun had risen high enough to burn away the gray from the city skyline. Daniel opened the door still half asleep, expecting the landlord or a delivery gone wrong. Instead, a woman stood in the hall, mid-30s, professional, but with the kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had seen too much of the world and still believed in telling its stories. "Mr. Ward," she said, breathless from the climb up the stairs. "I'm Mara Ellis. I write for the Chronicle." She hesitated, scanning the narrow hallway, the chipped door frame, the life too small for the name she had spent a week trying to trace. "I'd like to talk to you about Asteron." Daniel leaned against the door, folding his arms. "You've already heard the story," he said evenly. Everyone has. Not yours, she replied. Not the real one. He studied her, the way her voice carried no pity, just a quiet urgency, like truth trying to get in before the world shut it out again. I don't want pity, he said finally. Then give us purpose, she countered. The words hung in the air, simple but sharp. He stepped aside. You've got 10 minutes. Inside, the apartment was modest. 2 rooms, a table scattered with Leo's drawings, a framed photo of Amelia under the willow tree. Mara didn't touch anything. She just took it all in with the reverence of someone witnessing a story worth protecting. Your son? She asked softly. Daniel nodded. He's at school. He keeps this place alive. They sat at the small kitchen table, the one that wobbled slightly when he leaned on it. Mara took out her recorder, but didn't turn it on yet. I'm not here for a headline, she said. I want people to understand who you are, not just what happened. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. Who I am. I'm a man who built something and lost it, but I'm also the man who walked away from bitterness before it ate him alive. He glanced toward Leo's empty chair. That's what matters. When she finally pressed record, the story came quietly, without theatrics. He spoke of beginnings, not betrayals, of nights in the lab with Amelia bringing coffee and laughter, of sketches drawn on napkins, of hope that technology could connect people instead of divide them. When he spoke of Richard, he didn't curse his name. He made choices, Daniel said simply, and so did I. Mine was to keep living. Mara didn't interrupt. She just listened, eyes glistening as she captured the kind of honesty that didn't need embellishment. When she left, the sky was gold with evening, and Daniel felt lighter, as if speaking aloud had loosened the knots that years of silence had tied around his heart. The next morning, the world woke up to a headline that stretched across every major outlet. The Forgotten Founder. The article wasn't scandalous. It didn't attack or accuse. It told a story about a man, a woman, a dream, and the quiet dignity that outlasted greed. Photos accompanied the piece, Daniel standing by his window, Leo's drawing taped to the wall behind him, an old photo of the Asteron lab, dust motes caught in sunlight, Amelia smiling beside a half-built prototype. The world didn't see a janitor or a fallen genius. They saw a father, a husband, a man who had chosen kindness in a world that prized conquest. Comments flooded in, not with outrage but with empathy. He reminds me of my dad, one wrote. We need more stories like his, said another. Within hours, Asteron's stock wavered. Investors called emergency meetings. The board demanded explanations. Richard Vance, once untouchable, found himself cornered by a truth too human to spin. It's emotional manipulation, he told them, voice sharp, but no one seemed to hear him. The public had already decided. And amid all that chaos, numbers falling, egos scrambling, the truth finally breathed. Not loudly, not vindictively, just freely, like a window opening after years of stale air. Daniel sat at the table that night with Leo, watching the flickering news coverage on the small TV. His son's face lit up when he saw the photograph. "That's you, Dad," he said proudly. Daniel smiled, eyes soft. "Yeah," he said, "that's me." But deep down he knew it wasn't about him anymore. It was about what truth looked like when it refused to die, when it survived long enough to matter again. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was finally ready to listen. The fall didn't happen all at once. It came in fragments, whispers in glass-walled offices, board members avoiding Richard's gaze, meetings that used to end in applause, now closing in tense silence. For years he had ruled Asteron like a conductor, leading a perfect symphony, every note, every voice under his control. But now the music had changed. The headlines that once praised him now questioned him. The boardroom that once echoed with deference now hummed with quiet rebellion. By the end of the week, the board called for an emergency vote. Richard sat at the head of the table, though everyone in the room knew that seat no longer belonged to him. He listened to phrases like brand integrity, public trust, and ethical transparency, the very words he'd used to silence others. Now they turned against him like sharpened glass. One by one, his allies looked away. He tried to speak, to remind them of what he'd built, but no one wanted to hear the man who had forgotten how to listen. When the vote was finished, the verdict was unanimous. Richard Vance was removed as CEO of Asteron Technologies. The announcement went public that afternoon, a brief statement crafted by the company's communications team. Effective immediately, Richard Vance has stepped down. Asteron Technologies recognizes Daniel Ward as co-founder and original visionary of the company. For Daniel, the news came through a radio broadcast while he was fixing the squeak in his mop handle. The voice was crisp and detached, the kind of tone reserved for facts that carried too much history. He turned the dial down and stared at the wall for a long time. It wasn't triumph he felt, it was stillness, the kind that follows a storm when the air feels lighter but the ground still remembers the rain. Later that day, reporters came knocking. "Mr. Ward, will you return to Asteron now that your name has been cleared?" one asked, holding out a microphone as though it were an olive branch. Daniel smiled faintly, his expression calm. "No," he said simply. "Some buildings aren't meant to be re-entered once the fire's out." The quote spread as quickly as the truth once had. Some called it poetic, others called it pride. But Daniel didn't care what they called it. He had learned long ago that validation from the world was the cheapest form of peace. He didn't want revenge, he wanted release. That evening, in the quiet of his small apartment, Daniel sat down with a blank sheet of paper. The light from the desk lamp spilled across the page as he picked up a pen and began to write. Not an email, not a statement, but a letter. "Richard, we could have built something beautiful. Instead, you built walls. I hope one day you learn the difference." He signed it simply, folded it carefully, and slid it into an envelope. He didn't expect a reply. The letter wasn't for reconciliation. It was closure. A week later, word spread through quiet channels that Richard had sold his remaining shares in Asteron. No fanfare, no public statement, just a transaction buried in the fine print of a quarterly filing. By the time the news surfaced, he was already gone. No one knew where. Some said he'd moved abroad. Others claimed he'd been seen in the countryside, gray-haired and unrecognizable, walking alone through markets where no one cared about stock prices or legacy. In the boardroom he'd once ruled, a new portrait was hung, Daniel and Richard together, back when ambition still looked like hope. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Asteron Technologies, founded on vision." When Daniel heard about it, he only smiled. "They finally got it half right," he murmured. He looked out his window at the city below, where towers shimmered in the fading light, glass and steel catching fire from the setting sun. Somewhere out there, the empire he had built still stood, but it no longer haunted him. He had let it burn, and from the ashes, something truer had survived. Richard's name would fade from the headlines, his silence becoming his last statement. Daniel didn't need to read it to understand. Some men fall loudly, others quietly, but all fall the same way, when they mistake ownership for purpose. And for the first time, Daniel Ward didn't feel like the man who lost everything. He felt like the man who had finally learned how to let go. The invitation arrived on a gray morning tucked between a stack of bills and a flyer for a local pizza place. The envelope bore the Asteron insignia, silver, embossed, heavy enough to carry history. Daniel turned it over in his hands for a long moment before opening it. Inside, printed on thick cardstock, were the words he never expected to see again. Founders Legacy Symposium, honoring the visionaries who built the future. Beneath it, in neat corporate lettering, a request. "We invite Mr. Daniel Ward to speak as an honored guest." He read it twice, then set it on the counter as though it might burn through the wood. The irony wasn't lost on him. Asteron, the company that had erased him, now wanted his words to decorate their redemption. When Leo came home from school, he found the letter still sitting there beside an untouched cup of coffee. "What's that?" he asked, swinging his backpack onto the chair. "An invitation," Daniel said, his voice somewhere between disbelief and fatigue. "To what?" "To a place I swore I'd never go back to." Leo unfolded the paper, reading aloud. "Founders Legacy Symposium," he grinned. "That's you, Dad." "You're the founder," Daniel chuckled softly. "Apparently I'm fashionable again." "So you're going?" He hesitated. "I don't know if I want to." Leo frowned. "Why not?" "Because," Daniel said quietly, "I left that place behind for a reason. Some fires shouldn't be reignited." Leo thought for a moment, then said something that caught his father completely off guard. "You told me once that music sounds better when you stop hiding from it." Daniel looked at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Did I?" Leo nodded. "Maybe your voice does too." The boy didn't say anything else after that. He didn't need to. Daniel picked up the invitation again and stared at it under the fading light. The paper was cold in his hand, but somewhere deep inside, something warm began to stir, the part of him that hadn't spoken in public since the night the world had laughed, the part that still believed in what he once built. 2 weeks later, he walked through the revolving doors of Asteron headquarters. The marble floors gleamed just as they always had, but the building felt different, quieter, almost reverent. People recognized him now. Some nodded respectfully, others simply watched, uncertain of how to approach the man whose story had rewritten the company's own. Backstage, a young coordinator handed him a microphone and whispered, "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Ward." Daniel smiled. "I've been ready for years," he said. When he stepped onto the stage, the room went still. The same hall that had once echoed with polite laughter at his expense was now filled with hundreds of faces, journalists, engineers, students, executives, waiting. The air hummed with expectation. Cameras flashed, but he didn't look at them. His gaze went to the front row, where Leo sat beside Olivia, his small hands clasped together, eyes shining with pride. Daniel adjusted the microphone. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "Innovation," he began, "isn't about invention. It's about intention. It's not about what you build, but why you build it, and who you become in the process." He paused, letting the words settle. "When we built Asteron, we wanted to make something that helped people connect. To each other, to the world, to something bigger than themselves. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that connection isn't built with circuits. It's built with compassion." The audience was silent, the kind of silence that means listening. Daniel smiled faintly. "The future doesn't need more products," he said. "It needs more purpose. Don't just create, care." He stepped back from the microphone. For a long heartbeat, there was nothing. Then applause began, slow, steady, rising like a wave breaking against the past. It filled the hall, rolled through the rafters, warm and real. Daniel didn't bow. He just nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement to the room and to himself. As he walked off stage, he glanced at Leo, who was on his feet clapping, eyes bright with pride. For the first time, Daniel felt no ghosts in that building, only the sound of truth, finally free to breathe. And as he left Asteron behind once more, he knew it wasn't an ending at all. It was a return, not to the company, but to himself. The night after the symposium felt strangely quiet, as if the city itself had paused to listen to something it didn't want to forget. The crowd had long dispersed, and the echo of applause still lingered faintly in Daniel's mind, not as noise, but as warmth. He stood alone in the lobby of Asteron's glass atrium, his reflection staring back from the polished floor. For the first time, it didn't feel like a stranger was looking back at him. Footsteps approached behind him, soft but deliberate. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. "You disappeared fast," Olivia said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and reproach. She stepped into the light, her heels clicking gently against the marble. She looked different tonight, less corporate armor, more herself. The kind of woman who'd seen the cost of ambition and decided to start paying in truth instead. "I've had my fill of microphones for one lifetime," Daniel said with a small smile. Olivia stopped beside him. "You did more than speak, Daniel. You changed the room. You reminded them what this was supposed to be about." He nodded, eyes on the reflection of the Asteron logo behind them. "Maybe. But words don't rebuild things. People do." She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "The board wants you back," she said. "Not as a token. As a consultant. They want your input on the next generation of tech initiatives. And this time," she unfolded the paper, tapping a line near the top, "your name would be on the walls, where it always should have been." Daniel looked at the offer, the neat black letters, spelling out what would have once been his dream. But now, staring at it, he felt no hunger for what it represented. The building around him was filled with ghosts, his, Amelia's, the version of himself that used to think legacy came from success. He exhaled slowly, then looked at Olivia. "Let's do something better," he said quietly. She blinked. "Better?" He nodded, a small fire kindling in his voice. "Asteron's already found its way again. It doesn't need me. But there are people out there who do, people like me, who lost something but still want to build." He leaned against the glass railing, eyes thoughtful. Single parents, veterans, underdogs who've been told the world's too big for them. What if we built something for them instead? Olivia frowned, curious. "A business?" "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. "A foundation. One that funds people who have the heart but not the backing. We don't build products. We build chances." She smiled at the thought, the kind of slow smile that comes when an idea feels right before it even takes shape. "You realize that sounds like work, not retirement," she teased. Daniel chuckled softly. "I've had enough rest to last a lifetime." They sat together at one of the lobby benches, the quiet hum of the city leaking through the glass walls. Olivia pulled a pen from her bag and flipped the contract over, scribbling notes on the blank side. "Okay," she said. "Funding startups led by single parents, veterans, underdogs. Got it. What do we call it?" Daniel looked up through the transparent roof, where the night sky stretched endless and clear. The stars shimmered faintly above the city lights, small but persistent, just like the people he wanted to help. His gaze softened as a name formed in his mind, one that had waited years to be spoken again in creation rather than loss. "Amelia Labs," he said. His voice was quiet, reverent. Olivia looked up at him, the name settling in the air like a promise. "Because of her?" He nodded. "Because love built this. Every blueprint I ever made started with her." For a long moment neither spoke. The world outside went on, cars moving, lights flickering, but inside something had shifted. Olivia wrote the name across the top of the paper in bold letters, Amelia Labs. When she looked back at him, Daniel was smiling in that quiet way of his, content, grounded, unburdened. "We'll need a team," she said. "We'll need a dream," he corrected softly. And as they sat beneath the starlit glass of the building that once symbolized everything he'd lost, Daniel realized it now represented something entirely new, beginnings, not born from ambition, but from love, reclaimed and shared. The empire he'd once built had burned down in pride. What they would build next would rise from grace. The warehouse still smelled faintly of sawdust and new beginnings. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows in wide, golden beams, landing across rows of long work tables covered in circuit boards, sketches, coffee mugs, and open laptops. The air thrummed with quiet energy. the kind that only comes from people who believe they're building something that matters. A place once abandoned now pulsed with purpose. Amelia Labs had been open for 3 months, and already it felt alive. The floors that Daniel had once swept as a janitor now echoed with the quick footsteps of engineers and dreamers. The same walls that had once contained silence and exhaustion now carried laughter, debate, and the low hum of creation. It wasn't a corporation, it wasn't an empire, it was a community, and every brick seemed to hum with gratitude for being given a second chance. Daniel stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching a group of interns argue passionately over the prototype of a solar-powered assistive device. They were young, earnest, full of the kind of optimism he thought the world had long since worn out of him. And yet, standing there, he felt that old spark, the one that used to keep him awake until sunrise, sketching possibilities on napkins and the backs of envelopes. "Dad?" The familiar voice rang through the hall before he saw him. Leo came sprinting down the corridor, a tablet clutched in his hands, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Dad, look what we made!" Daniel crouched as his son skidded to a stop, holding the screen like treasure. It displayed a small program, simple, elegant, that translated handwritten notes into speech for people with vision loss. "I helped design the interface," Leo said proudly, tapping the screen to demonstrate. A soft, computerized voice echoed his words. Daniel's throat tightened. "That's incredible," he said, and it wasn't just pride he felt. It was awe. Leo beamed, all freckles and sincerity. "Miss Olivia said we're going to make it part of the accessibility project." "Miss Olivia, huh?" Daniel teased. "You two seem to be taking over my job." "Someone has to keep you humble," came Olivia's voice from behind him. She stepped into the light with a clipboard under one arm, her sleeves rolled up, her hair falling loose from the bun she'd tied that morning. There was dust on her shoes and ink smudged on her wrist, proof that she worked, not watched. Daniel stood, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two people who had walked through fire and somehow found the same path on the other side. "You see this?" he said, gesturing toward the tablet. "This is what happens when you let the next generation take the lead." Olivia smiled, tucking the clipboard under her arm. "This is what happens when you give people room to build instead of telling them what they can't do." They watched as Leo ran back toward the workshop, disappearing into the crowd of young inventors. The sound of his laughter blended with the hum of machines and the chatter of collaboration, a symphony of progress that filled the once empty space. The world outside had long since moved on. The headlines had faded. The scandal, the betrayal, the fight for truth, all of it had become old news in a world hungry for the next story. But inside these walls, something deeper had taken root. What grew here wasn't born from revenge. It was born from redemption, from choosing to build light instead of chasing shadows. Daniel walked slowly across the room, passing sketches pinned to corkboards, and ideas written on whiteboards in colorful ink. Empathy is the new innovation, technology for the unseen. Build from love, not fear. Each phrase was a heartbeat of what they were creating, not just devices, but hope. He stopped by one of the windows, sunlight catching the silver streaks in his hair. "You ever think she'd believe this?" he asked softly. Olivia joined him, following his gaze toward the warehouse floor, where a mural had been painted on the far wall, a simple line drawing of a willow tree with the words, "Love built this," written beneath. "She'd believe it," Olivia said. "She'd say it was exactly where you were meant to end up." Daniel smiled, the kind that came from somewhere deep, somewhere healed. Maybe she'd be right. Outside, the day stretched open, bright, and full of motion. Inside, the hum of creation continued, steady, purposeful, alive. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like he was chasing light. He was standing in it. The morning was quiet in that way the world sometimes chooses to honor what it cannot understand. The cemetery sat on a small hill just outside the city, where the noise softened and the wind carried the faint smell of rain. Daniel walked slowly along the path, a small bouquet of daisies in his hand, Leo trailing beside him with his jacket zipped up to his chin. It had been years since that hospital room, but the memory never faded. Not the sound of the monitor, not the stillness that came after. They reached the grave, a simple stone with her name etched clean and timeless. Amelia Ward. Loved beyond measure. Daniel crouched down and brushed away a few fallen leaves. The ground was damp, the kind that clung to fingertips, but he didn't mind. He placed the daisies neatly at the base of the stone, fingers lingering for a moment as though the warmth of his hand could still reach her. "Hey," he said quietly, almost smiling. "We did it." "Not the way I planned, but the way you would have wanted." Leo stood beside him, hands tucked into his pockets, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. "You talk to her like she can hear you," he said softly. Daniel nodded. "I like to think she can." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the breeze play gently through the tall grass. The city skyline rose faintly in the distance, the sunlight breaking through clouds and catching on the glass towers. It was the same view Daniel used to look at from the factory floor years ago, when skyscrapers looked like dreams that belonged to other people. Leo finally spoke. "You built something that helps people again, didn't you?" Daniel looked down at his son, that same spark of wonder in his eyes that Amelia used to have. "We built it, kiddo," Hyatt said. "Together." Leo grinned. "You think Mom knows?" Daniel smiled, his voice catching just slightly. "If she doesn't, she's probably giving me hell about the logo." Leo laughed, and for a moment the grief that always hovered between them softened into something gentler. Daniel reached out and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "She'd be proud of you, you know," he said. Leo looked at the flowers, his voice quiet. "She'd be proud of you, too." They stayed a little longer, not speaking, just listening to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't sadness that filled Daniel now, but something steadier. Peace, maybe, or gratitude. He thought of all the years he'd spent chasing redemption, building empires only to lose them, running from ghosts he couldn't outpace. And yet, standing there, he realized he hadn't been running at all. He'd been finding his way back. When they finally turned to leave, the sky had opened fully, the light pouring across the grass like forgiveness. As they walked back down the hill, Leo slipped his hand into his father's. Small, warm, certain. They didn't talk about the past or the future. They didn't need to. At the bottom of the path, Daniel glanced back once more at the grave, at the daisies swaying gently in the wind. "Thank you," he whispered, so quietly only the earth could hear it. Then he faced forward again. The city stretched before them, alive and humming. Cars moved like veins of light through the streets, and somewhere out there, the people of Amelia Labs were already at work, creating, helping, dreaming. The skyline no longer looked like ambition to Daniel, it looked like connection. Every face he passed in the city now felt like part of something he had once forgotten. That greatness isn't measured in wealth or titles or applause. It's measured in how much light you leave behind. As they reached the car, Leo tugged on his sleeve. "Hey, Dad," he said. "You think this is home now?" Daniel looked toward the horizon, the warehouse in the distance, the people who had found hope within its walls, the life he'd built from ruin. "Yeah," he said softly, "it is." They drove off together, the afternoon sun stretching long across the road, the skyline fading slowly in the mirror, but Daniel didn't look back. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to, because sometimes the greatest comeback isn't returning to the top. It's returning to yourself. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Someone out there might need its light today. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what part of Daniel's journey spoke to you most. And if you believe in stories that heal, uplift, and remind us that it's never too late to begin again, hit subscribe, because more stories like this are on the way.